Hey guys, welcome back to Denmark, the good version of Denmark, the version of Denmark that has two spawn locations. And if we look at our radar screen here, we look at TWS, we look at the scoreboard, we're already in a 4 versus 8. And this game did not start as a 4 versus 8, and it didn't go particularly badly for my team. This is the way that Sim works. People die a little bit too much, people can't really afford it, and then the teams kind of evaporate. And blue team usually has more players. So what are we going to do? We're going to pretend that multipathing doesn't exist for a little bit, and we're going to go defensive right away, because this is, in theory, what you would have to do if multipathing wasn't a thing. You couldn't fly straight into the enemy team because you would basically eat an active radar missile. Now, in my previous video, the reason I did not mention that the new suggestion is to reduce multipathing to 50 to 60 meters, which in my opinion, is effectively kind of the same thing. Most of these maps have trees on them. A lot of these maps have trees that are over 50 meters, and basically the desire is to make it so that your defense against radar missiles is to not go low to the deck. Now, in theory, that is well and good. I have tested it. The new Fox 3 missiles they're pretty easy to chaff or flare, to decoy. I don't know if that's going to be the case once it gets to the live server. There are some people that are saying that it's too easy to decoy them because it goes for one piece of chaff and it needs to be a lot harder and you need to be able to stay in the notch. And I don't know if that's true. It probably is because, realism is kind of flexible in this game. But the realism or die crowd is not really in tune with the fact that the whole entire setup of the game is not realistic. Like, I just spawned and I'm going defensive to basically the back corner of my map, and I have two people chasing me. I have Butters off in the distance. I have some JAS 39 Gripen. It's only been basically 2 minutes since I've spawned, and I am turning around to at least merge with one of these guys. If I keep running forever, I just run to the airfield, I get boxed in one corner of the map against two guys, and right now we're going to abuse the multipathing, because if we don't, we're just going to get ran down. And we can tell that this guy's a Gripen. He just sprays in the head-on, and Butters is in the distance. He's looking to kill us, and I have him in VC in this game. I'm like, well, at least let me kill the damn Gripen, because when I see a Gripen, I want to kill them, even though, I play the plane a lot too, so you can call me a hypocrite, but it is what it is. But we come down on top of him, and because we're schizo-flaring, because we're trying to avoid the third-party missile that we think is inevitably coming because 9Ms exist or 9Ls exist, we've done one engagement. We're down to 15 chaff and 15 flares. If Fox 3 missiles are able to put you on the defensive almost immediately, it's very likely in something like the Su-27 that you're just going to run out of countermeasures while one or two guys spams all of their missiles at you, which that might be the strategy going forward. If the Fox 3s get the chaff resistance that is present in a missile like the R-27ER, if that is going to be used as the benchmark for how hard it is to notch or decoy something, I can see that very well becoming the de facto strategy. Because right now, the R-27ER without using multipathing is incredibly hard to decoy. There are certain aspects and certain distances where if it's launched, you're just not going to get away from it. In all honesty, in a non-multipathing or de facto non-multipathing meta, one of the easiest ways to beat planes like the F-16 and planes with lower flare counts, even 120, really just isn't. It's not a lot when a guy can shoot 6 R-27ERs at you, because by the time he gets to R-73 range, you might be completely out of countermeasures. At the same time, splitting the countermeasures buttons into separate bindings might not be all that helpful, because if he mixes in an R-27 ET at the right time, you're just going to eat that too. So let's abandon Denmark and let's abandon the Su-27 for a second. Let's move over to the blue side and let's play one of the quote-unquote good maps for enduring confrontation. Let's assume that Sinai is removed from the rotation. Let's assume that Denmark is removed from the rotation. Let's assume that all of the maps that are flat are removed from the rotation, and basically we're limited to Rocky Canyon, Afghanistan, and Spain. Those would be the only 3 EC maps. What happens when there's a bunch of terrain? What happens when we get up in the sky and we're only in a map with 2 players on the enemy team? There might be 3, and we're just going to fly this line basically up this right side between where the toilet bowl on the map is formed and kind of the right side mountain ranges. And what's going to happen is basically within 2 to 3 minutes, we have already spotted the enemy team on the radar. We already know where both of these guys are. We know that they're both split up, they're separated, and we can see that we have what is presumably a MiG-29 or an Su-27 closer, and then we have a guy further away, and we can see the friendly is going to merge with the guy that's further away, so we can fight this guy pretty safely, because this is the one instance of like, okay, we're going to have the isolated 1v1 that we want to have in Sim. The only reason that these happen is when the game is small. When the game is large, this same route is going to be infested with like just a ton of people. And usually some of these routes are kind of all the same. Like, people congregate to hotspots on the map. Like, people don't want to admit that, but that's what happens. So we're going to notch his missile. And as long as this 27ER is launched at like a reasonable distance, it's pretty easily to defeat. But once he gets close, if he gets too close, and he launches it from medium close range in a no escape zone, without multipathing, we die. Like, full stop, we die. If we defend against all 6, we're already down to 40 flares. We only defended against 1. If we defend against all 6, we'd run out of countermeasures, and we probably die anyways. If we have to defend against multiple opponents from different angles, probably still die. If multipathing doesn't exist there, I die. If there's a second guy within the no escape zone with another R27ER or with a Fox 3, I would also die. And we get behind this guy, and we're going to hold on to our speed. We're dogfighting. And in the meantime, if this is a bigger game, the thing that the player is going to do is going to press the cover me button. Usually, you should press the cover me button before you even get to your dogfight. That way, players on your team know, hey, go over here. We can go help this guy. And that's how the quote-unquote furball forms. And the furball doesn't form just because IR missiles exist or just because we can't engage at long distances. The furball is going to form regardless, because having a localized numerical superiority is just good tactical sense. Like, it doesn't take a genius to know that if you have 5 players and you merge with 10, the 10 players are probably going to win. And this is the same perspective from a different game. This is a large sim game. This is not the 2 versus 2. This is a 10 versus 10. This is that stage I was talking about where the game reaches kind of the critical mass. And we're going to be flying up the same side of the map. And instead of going directly into the enemy team, we're going to kind of detour a little bit to the right and kind of hide in the valley here. Now, the reason this kind of works well right now is because most people are low. Most people are trying to use multipathing. Once you put people at altitude, like I was doing, it's really easy to detect and vector yourself into the enemy team, or to decide whether or not you want to engage or not. Adding longer range missiles means that you have to be more aware of how many players are within that no escape zone. And these maps might be too small for that, and they might be too small at this kind of stage in the game, because what's already happening is my team is pushing up that right side of the map, and as soon as we get a good push, we're going to basically run a train in front of their airfields and spawn trap them. And we're not doing it on purpose. We're not really coordinating it. I have Butters on my team, but he's not in the voice channel with me. He's doing like technical work crap and playing the game at the same time. But it's just something that's going to naturally develop. People fly towards their RWR markings. They fly towards where they know the enemy team is going to spawn. And that's what happens. Like, it has happened in every single game that I've ever played that has had fixed respawn locations. Like, there is a reason that Call of Duty has its goofy rotating team spawn locations. There's a reason that Battlefield 4 has like a base that you spawn into where you can't really be attacked from. This is an incredibly basic game design element that Warthunder still hasn't figured out. They haven't figured it out in Ground RB, and they certainly have not figured it out in Air Sim. We are going to skip ahead again. We are arriving at kind of what is the eventuality of a lot of these Air Sim games that I play. If we look at the radar, we're pointed towards the enemy base. We do have the enemy base more or less in sight, close to the horizon, and you can see that I have about 3 to 4 teammates that are more or less just running a train in front of their airfield. They're basically in the control point that I kind of highlighted in my previous video. This is just something that naturally happens, by the way. This is not a coordinated assault on their... But it's still relatively easy for them to be able to squirt out of it just by sticking low and then pre-flaring in the head-on, because all of our IRCCM missiles are not very viable when fired from a head-on aspect against a target that at least knows that you're in front of them. And that's not something that we can quite understand about active radar homing missiles at the moment. With a reduced multipathing, we don't know how it's going to work at scale, because yes, it's easy to run towards an IR missile and flare it, but by running towards the IR missile and running below the radar missiles, it means that you get access to the center of the map. If you are forced to go on the defensive basically as soon as you take off, it probably has the effect of basically herding you and your entire team into a corner where they can be slaughtered. We don't even know how the current implementation of active radar homing missiles, like if the stuff that is on the dev server comes directly to live, how that's going to shift the style of play within Sim. We don't know that giving everyone a missile with a much longer range that has a credible chance of third-partying you is going to make dogfighting a lot more risky than it already is, because even with our short-range missiles, these maps start feeling incredibly small, especially anytime you get over 6 players on each side. It's more common to have your dogfight interrupted by a third party than it is to win it, and usually when it comes to dogfighting within Sim, it's not just about winning the 1v1, it's about winning the 1v1 and then setting up for the next guy that's coming in, who's only like a minute or two away by the time that you started the fight. You might only have like a 30-second warning before you're already dealing with the next guy. Just the fact that that next guy could potentially third-party you from a much further distance now might actually shift the Sim meta in a way that we don't quite understand yet. Just the fact that you could ripple fire the active radar missiles within their active range might make some of these furballs that we have a lot less viable than they currently are, because if you're not running flares and chaff at the same time and you don't have the correct aspect to those missiles, it might be very easy for a guy in an F-15 to just ripple fire 4 of his AMRAMs at 3 guys that are dogfighting and get 3 kills that way. It also might be such that merging with the Mirage 2000 with the Mica ER with the thrust vectoring missile, if they fix it, might actually be suicide depending on how it's implemented. Just the fact that there's going to be more missiles in the air at any given time, fired from any given distance in any given aspect, might be enough to take the game mode that is already pretty claustrophobic and make it suffocating. With testing the current iteration of ARH missiles on dev server, with the way that they are very easy to decoy and the way that the R27ER is extremely hard to decoy, might have the effect of shifting the whole entire meta in favor of the Su-27, where the R27ER could become the best radar missile in the game and actually become way more effective, and effective in a way that hurts the health of the game mode, even more so than the way that broken planes like the Gripen does. And that's kind of my core message with the game, is yeah, things are bad now, but they can always be worse. So what do I actually recommend for Sim? What would be the smartest way to go about this? I think number one is don't put the cart before the horse. Like, let active radar missiles come to the game and see what happens before we immediately jump to the conclusion that multipathing needs to go. The second thing that should be an option is that you should have the option of removing multipathing in a custom game. This way it would enable players to actually play test it, because that's my biggest concern, is not so much that defending radar missiles is too hard or that people can't master it or can't understand it. My issue is with the scale of the game itself. I know for basically, as a matter of fact, the 16 versus 16 single spawn mode in Air RB, a no multipathing or reduced multipathing would be a complete and utter clusterfuck. For instance, if the BVR aspect isn't actually effective, if trying to force the enemy team on the defensive with a wave of radar missiles is actually relatively easy to defeat, where you notch, the enemy team runs out of missiles, and then you turn back in, and because you saved yours, you just carry your missiles to the no escape zone and then shoot the enemy team. That might be the way that the player base would adapt to that kind of situation. It might turn active radar missiles into more or less undodgeable IR missiles, or the way that IR missiles are used now. The same thing could be said about the R27ER. In that kind of situation, the R27ER might be the most powerful missile in the game that doesn't have any suitable counters to it, because the angles in a 16v16 game are so varied and so diverse that by the time you match all the angles and you do all the chaffing and the flaring, you either A, you run out of chaff and flares, or B, you didn't have the angles correct. They came in from too many sides and your team has died and collapsed. As far as sim is concerned, the things that would need to be addressed is basically the core structure of the game, the way that spawns work in the way that team balance is addressed, because it's rather ridiculous to be in a game that is 3 versus 7 or 3 versus 10 and have any expectations of being able to hold it together until other people decide to join. There are also a couple of suggestions out there that I think are not very good, that are not very well thought out. For instance, the addition of SAM sites to the airfield so that you have a protective bubble that extends further away from your airfield, in principle sounds like a good idea. In practice, usually what happens is when you implement an AA bubble that people can exploit, you're going to have people shooting missiles from inside their AA bubble outside of it, and they're going to play the whole game from the protection of their airfield. I don't think this is a really good idea. On the other hand, one of the things that I think that could be done that could make a little bit more sense is having flexible spawn locations. So instead of having 5 different airfields that are all concentrated into one corner of the map, you just have that far back line where you can pick basically any spot within, say, your final 2 grid squares that you can spawn into. That way you can spawn in the middle of the map, you can spawn in the corner, you can spawn in the other corner. I think that would be a perfectly viable option. At the same time, that would allow you to spawn your plane in with some speed. However, in reality, I think by far the best solution that Warthunder could possibly come up with is actually come up with a game mode that is dedicated to that style of combat. For instance, yes, we have these big maps, but once you put 8 people on each side, they get a little bit small. Once you add perpetual respawns, all of a sudden, there's a bunch of missiles in the air at all times. You never actually exhaust the enemy team. An easy solution to this is to implement a 5 versus 5 game mode that has like 3 different rounds and has contested airspace in the center, and you try to win control of the airspace, and your team spawns on one side of the map, the enemy team spawns on the other, and then you guys fly at each other and you shoot BBR missiles until you run out, and then you merge and you do all the good stuff. Now, do these suggestions actually matter? No, I'm not in charge of the game. I don't do any kind of game design. I have no weight with Gaijin. I'm not even in the content creator program. That, and I think the ship has already sailed. Most of the sim community seems to be behind the idea that multipathing needs to be reduced to 50 meters, 60 meters, whatever the number is, that would effectively more or less remove it, or remove it as the option of first resort for many players. Which is fine, because I'm not immune to adapting, and I'm not immune to learning how to play the game differently, but the way that I adapt to the way that the game changes might not be in a way that a lot of people like. And every player in the game has the same means of adaptation that I do. And that means that the tactical and strategic gameplay that you envision with the end of multipathing, with the reduction of multipathing, might not look tactical and strategic at all. It might just look like mutually assured destruction, which is why I say that you should playtest it first, instead of making assumptions based on a Growling Sidewinder 1v1 or something you drew in Microsoft Paint. Anyways, that's the video. The Griffin stays winning.